My name is Maria Yutkevich. I'm the head of the Center for Institutional Analysis at Higher School of Economics, which hosts a summer school. And it's my particular pleasure and honor to open the first day of the summer school today. And we're happy to say a few words about why the summer school and why you're here. So the summer school is actually the first summer school in HEC. We started many years ago, so that's our summer school number 12. The older summer school in HEC. We are also the first international summer school, which means that for many years ago we switched from Russian into English, and you can see the reason why we did that. The reason is sitting here. Because we wanted to invite John to be a part of the summer school for many, many years ago, and John said, "Da," but at that time it was the only word he knew in Russian. So we forced everybody to switch into English. So I think it's a very good example how one person, one single idea can change the environment and everything. So now we are completely in English, so please communicate in English between you as well. So why the summer school? Many reasons, but probably the most important one is because we want to build an academic community. We want young scholars and future scholars to become a part of large academic community. And we want you to have wider horizons, meet new people, meet new ideas. That's why we bring here both you as participants and also faculty. And since we started many years ago, as I said, some people who came here from tiny regional universities across Russia or from other countries, they first knew from our faculty that they can go somewhere outside their own city, outside their own region, or even country. And we now have some assistant professors working in US and European universities who first started from the summer school, then learned they can go for PhD somewhere, they got a PhD and they got a position now. So you also have a lot of opportunities ahead of you. So two main ingredients of the summer school. The first main ingredient is our faculty. Those are generous people devoted the whole week of their time to come here and be with us. So it's my particular thank you for all of you who came here and give us the precious things, which is time, because time in academia is probably the most scarce resource. So thank you for coming. And it's important to note that faculty are here with us not only for lectures, but also for the whole summer school, which means that you can approach them and use them as intellectual partners for the whole week long. So if you see faculty having a dinner or watching a football or swimming in the swimming pool, you can approach them and say, "Hello, I want to discuss my research project." So be free to do that. And faculty would be really happy to discuss their projects with you. So the second ingredient is you, actually participants, because it's not only about lectures or even some feedback from faculty, but also communication between you. And many ideas and many co-authorship were born from this kind of peer cooperation. And peers are very important. That's why we'd also kindly ask you not to use your computers and phones during lectures and workshops, just because for you to be really part of the process. And probably final word, that this summer school was actually a result of many organizational effort, but also financial one. And it was supported both by Higher School of Economics and also by Jean Monnet Foundation, which is a part of Erasmus program. And thanks to the generous support, we are all here and able to run the summer school. I don't want to spend more time on introductory words. Again, thanks faculty for being here. We are really happy to have a great team of you on board. And again, my pleasure to give a floor to John Nye, who is probably the oldest in terms of number of school visited international faculty here. And John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Masha. This is my 9th summer school, I believe. I will also correct Masha. The first Russian words I learned were "Еще раз 100 грамм водки, пожалуйста." But at any rate, it's relevant for today's talk. Most of the time, we present current research and often technical research that we're doing. But I thought for this year, I would do something different. I will present a book of mine from 10 years ago, partly because I think it's a fun topic, it's a good way to start the summer school, partly because I think it's also a way for me to introduce the problem of how do you begin a big project? This project took 15 to 20 years of my life for a very short book. And so, I produced about 3 or 4 papers out of it and a book for Princeton University Press in 2007. But at the same time, I'm not going to talk about most of the technical details, but I'm going to focus on the bigger story of the economics of it. So, throughout this week, you're going to hear a lot of talks about very important topics. Banking, behavioral economics, public procurement, things like this. But today we're going to talk about something really important. Why do the British drink beer? As we know, that's one of the most important topics in all of economics. A less important topic is how did Britain succeed in raising taxes in the 18th century? And finally, how did mercantilist Britain, or mercantilist England, which was had very high tariffs, become eventually free trade Britain? And we're going to talk about these issues as part of my book. Now, it didn't start out as my wanting to write a book. I was an economic historian specializing in France, not in Britain. However, my first job, where I spent 22 years of my life, was at Washington University in St. Louis. And I was very lucky that my senior colleague in economic history there was Douglas North, whom some of you may have heard of. And as a result of working with North, and I had graduated from Northwestern with a PhD under Joel Mokyr, who is still there today, and I believe Northwestern now produces the largest number of tenured assistant professors in economic history in the world. So when I first went there, I was doing a project on France, and one of the things I discovered was I started working on England. And as I worked on England, one of the things I did was to compare tariffs in Britain and France. And you all know the story. The story is, in the 1840s, the corn laws were abolished, Britain went to free trade, and it led the world in free trade and eventually caused all the other countries to copy them. That story is wrong. And it's wrong because nobody bothered to check the statistics. Everybody talked about this. Historians wrote books and books about them, and nobody had ever bothered to look at the trade statistics and actually look at what the actual tariffs were. I'll tell you what I found out. So, here's this picture, and remember, the old days it took a lot more data. In fact, I used this with a defunct program. In those days, I was using Quattro Pro, which was a kind of cheap version of Lotus, which was, Excel wasn't very popular in those days. So this is all like pre-Windows. And that shows you how old I am. And one of the things I did was to get data from Britain and get data from France. In particular, the French data were less well known. I got hold of the data from what's called the Tableau décennal du commerce. And I also got data from a book on French economic history by 2 distinguished French economists, François Bourguignon and Maurice Louis-Dupaillet. And what I found is the following. Now, in those days, you're like typing in the numbers by hand, and then you pop out the graph, and then only later do you put the legends, the titles. So when I first did this, I assumed the lower curve was Britain, and the upper curve was France. It was my surprise when I put the numbers, and I said, wait a minute, this is Britain. Right? This is Britain. Right? And this is France. I said, what? Now, this is a very simple calculation. This is not a rigorous measure of protection, but it is commonly used in the trade literature. This is called the average tariff rate. The average tariff rate is just calculated by dividing the value of all tax revenues, all tariffs, divided by the average value, but divided by the value of all imports. Right? So it's a very crude measure. So I did this, and I looked at this and I said, this can't be right. So I checked the numbers, and I got a slightly different, I looked at it, I kept getting the same result. So I said, let me ask my colleague across the hall for his advice. So I knocked on the door of North, and I said, Doug, can I show you something? I was a young assistant professor. I showed him the printout, and he said, are you sure about this, John? He said, Doug, have you heard anything like this? Has anybody ever mentioned that France had lower tariffs than Britain for most of the 19th century? Notice it's from 1820 all the way to the 1880s. No, he didn't. Are you sure? Go call some people. Then in the old days, this is before the internet, right? Or the internet wasn't very big yet. So I remember calling up McCloskey at Iowa. I called up my advisor, Mo Kier. Harold said they hadn't heard about this. They said, are you sure? Go check the numbers. I called up Larry Neal, who was at that time at Illinois, and Larry Neal was the editor-in-chief of Explorations in Economic History, the second most important economic history journal. And Larry said, no, you should do it. Larry said to me, John, you'd better get this right. This is either a great discovery or you're going to be called a great idiot. So don't screw this up. So I did this, and I checked this, and in fact, that's why I got the originals copy of the Tableau décennal de commerce. And in fact, when I redid it using the official French numbers, the French averages even fell below this. So it was quite impressive. In those days, also, working papers were very important. In those days, one of the reasons to be in a top university was that you were part of the working paper series. You didn't get it by the internet. They literally mailed copies of the working papers to a list of about 50 universities. If you weren't on that list, you don't get to see the working papers. And I remember that working paper list came out in less than 1 week after we sent it out by mail. I was getting phone calls. Everybody wanted me to fly out. So I flew out to Massachusetts, to the University of Massachusetts, to Harvard, to Stanford, to Berkeley, Northwestern. They all flew me out, and they all wanted to attack me. I still remember that when I went to Harvard, it was the first time I lectured at Harvard. It was one of the most scary moments of my life. The room was packed with people. And I remember the chairman at the time, Jeff Williamson, said, John, people have come all the way from New York to attack you. And so that we went into this. Now, why did I find this? Well, it turns out that one of the stories you always hear is Britain removed most of the tariffs from the Corn Laws. But it turns out most of the tariffs they removed were on items that were not very important in trade. In the items that were important in trade, they left them high. In contrast, France had lots of tariffs, but often on not very important items. So historians who aren't economists and don't like to look at numbers just observed that Britain removed like 2,000 tariffs, and France didn't change many of their tariffs, so they assumed, and Britain said they were free trade, and after all, when does a politician lie? So of course, that's what you would expect, right? And so you have all these historic, I was just shocked. I went through the literature, and everybody repeated the same story, and nobody ever bothered to check. The other thing that was interesting too is that tariffs were mainly on items like wine, sugar, coffee, and tea. So people said, oh, these aren't very important. Well, going back to the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith talks about how important the wine tariffs are and such a big deal. It was, in fact, for Britain, say, to have no tariffs on manufacturers is not a very big thing because Britain was the world leader in manufacturers. So in fact, removing tariffs on items that you have a comparative advantage in doesn't do much to change your protection if you keep it on the things you don't. The equivalent today is Japan. Japan now has low tariffs on manufacturers, but Japan is very good at making, say, cars. What they're not very good at is agriculture. So rice imports are mostly prohibited to Japan. I often say the US should make a deal that we will allow the Japanese to raise their tariffs on cars 25% if they will let US rice come in even at a very high tariff. Because that would be a huge gain for the US. But nobody talks about this. And the other thing that was very surprising about this is that France was a specific target of these policies. Okay? And again, this wasn't talked about very much in the trade literature. It was talked about in the wine literature. So that in fact, I had the hard job of combining archival materials from Paris with Bordeaux, and I had to drink a lot of good French wine. And it was while I was doing this research, and it was a very great hardship, but somebody had to do this tough job. Okay? So, the other thing is, once I did this paper, it came out in the Journal of Economic History. It was very controversial, but I was runner-up for the best paper of the year in the Economic History Association's journal. But a lot of people say, well, these aren't very rigorous, because what we try to do is use very crude adjustments for demand to try to check for robustness. But they say, you really need to build a model. Well, it turns out one of the problems for trade is that in order to build a general equilibrium model, you need a good measure of what it means to deviate from free trade. But it turns out that going back 150 years, there are no well-accepted measures of what it means to be not free trade. Do you understand what I'm getting at? The problem is this. We understand what it means to be pure free trade. No quotas, no prohibitions, no tariffs, zero. But now, how do I compare a country, say, with 10% tariffs on 90% of the items and 100% tariffs on 10%, versus a country that has a mix of 5%, 15%, 30%, 70% tariffs? It turns out there's no unique mathematical mapping from a set of tariffs onto a unidimensional measure of trade. So this is a well-known theoretical problem, and it's tied to the problem of the law of the second best. The only paper that tried to deal with this, and imperfectly, was a paper by Anderson and Neary in Econometrica in the 1980s. Anderson and Neary basically postulated that under certain assumptions, in which you had to make some assumptions about national utility functions, what you could do is you could sort of say, if we could replace all the tariffs in a country by a single tariff that has the same utility effect as the current mix of tariffs, we can call that its measure of trade, in some sense, deviation from free trade. There are a lot of assumptions that go into that, but at the time I was writing this article, it was the only semi-rigorous paper that had been written to try to do these measures. There's a big problem, however, I found out with using Anderson and Neary. Anderson and Neary assume that the countries are perfectly competitive. Britain and France were two of the largest countries in world trade at the time. In the 19th century, they were probably the two most important countries in the world in the early 19th century, so they have some market power. If they have some market power, the conditions of Anderson and Neary don't hold. So we had to create a new set of measures, partly based upon Anderson and Neary, but now where we do, the problem is instead of a unique point, now you basically have a plane. And so what we had to do is we say, what we had to do now is create a simulation in CGE under which you say, assume we drop all the tariffs to zero in both countries. Which one has a bigger revenue, a welfare effect? That's the one that was more protectionist. And when we did that, under most scenarios, France was less protectionist than Britain. So there was another paper of mine that got published. It got published in Public Choice because at the time when I submitted to the AER, they said this is very good, but this is too historical. The same thing JPE said, the same thing QJE. Today, economic history is fashionable. So you see economic history in all the top journals, including Econometrica. But in my day, I would submit them to top journal, and they would sort of say, oh, this is economic history, it shouldn't be in the main journal. So I was born at the wrong time. So one of my piece of advice to students is make sure you're born at the right time. Now, it turned out, as I looked at this, I went back to the literature. And I said, why don't people talk about this? And it turns out the more I looked into it, the more I began to realize that this trade story wasn't just about trade. It was about revenue in general. The tariffs the British were imposing was part of a unified revenue system that did not meet optimality in the economic sense, but it was optimal in the political economy sense. And as I looked at it, I got to answer what looks like a totally different question. One of the most highly cited papers in all of economics is the paper by North and Weingast on the Glorious Revolution. It's about the first economic history paper talking about the problem of credible commitment. What's credible commitment? The idea is that if your king is too strong, he can't borrow money. Why is that? Because if he's very strong, he's not going to pay you back. And if he's very weak, he can be overthrown, so he's not going to pay you back also. So credible commitment occurs when the government can create conditions that will make people believe that they will be paid back. And part of the story North and Weingast say is that when the Glorious Revolution came in 1688 and 1689, in the Glorious Revolution, the British overthrew the Catholic king and replaced him with a monarch from Holland who didn't even speak English, William of Orange, right? But because he was, in some sense, an outsourced king, they were able to weaken the king's powers and create a division of power between parliament and the king. And as a result, North and Weingast say, England was able to have more credible commitment, so they could actually borrow more money because their interest rates fell. That's what this paper was about, okay? In other words, he's sort of saying, and plus the English created the Bank of England, the first major modern central bank, which was independent. In fact, the initial Bank of England was privately owned. And the advantage of having a formal bank process the money was, in addition to credibility, you have a formal money market now, so you can observe implicit changes in the market as an index of the credibility of a given policy. And again, all this helped England, which became Great Britain later on, borrow more money and lower interest rates. The problem that North and Weingast had, and I used to bother, at that time I was at WashU, both North and Weingast were at WashU. So I used to go to lunch with them and I used to fight with them. And I used to tell Doug, I said, okay, I understand that if they borrow money, they now have to tax money, right? I said, but why are they able to collect the money? If you know anything about tax policy, you'll realize that raising taxes doesn't automatically raise revenue. A very good way to think about this example is American top tax rates have varied tremendously in the last 60 years. At one time, today the high point is only like 33 or 34% on the highest earners. Actually, it's 35% under Obama, that's right. So 35% on the highest earners. At one time in the 50s, the top US marginal tax rate was 91%. And it's gone all the way. And yet, despite the large range of US tax rates, the federal share of GDP has almost never varied more than 18% plus or minus 1 or 2%. So in periods of very high tax rates and very low tax rates, the share of the federal government in GDP was roughly the same. Britain managed to successfully increase their taxes 450%. No other country in Europe did that. So I asked Doug, I used to say, how did Britain collect more money? They didn't just raise tax rates. Something had to happen. Now, a historian, John Brewer, says it's just professionalization. He says the British created the first modern tax collecting system, where you had a central tax authority and collected taxes. You have to understand, most countries prior to Britain did not collect taxes the way modern taxes are collected. They collected taxes with tax farmers. What's a tax farmer? In France, for example, or in Germany or Italy, they had tax farmers. Tax farmer was the following. A tax farmer is somebody who comes to the king and says, I will pay you a certain amount of money for the right to collect taxes in a certain area. So anything I collect above that, I get to keep. Right? That's a tax farmer. That's why, and that goes back to biblical times, which is why tax collectors were hated. If you're tax farming, your incentives are to collect taxes even if people are pissed off at you. Right? And the king fully understood that tax farmers could destroy the stability of the realm, because if they enforced it too strictly, you will get uprisings and revolts. It is an indication of how difficult it was to collect taxes that the kings basically gave up revenue in exchange for certainty. That also violates modern macro, which tend to sort of say that the state is usually the most credible holder of risk relative to the subunits of the state. Well, that was not true for most of European history. Britain was the first to kind of create a centralized professional tax authority who collected on behalf of the state without tax farming. So Brewer is right that those guys did it, but that's not a good answer. Because simply saying that you create a professional system doesn't guarantee you collect the money. I mean, if it's just that, why doesn't France do it? France talks about it and doesn't do it. Other countries talk about it, they don't do it. What makes it possible for them to impose a tax and make sure it gets paid? My argument is the following. As I did more work, I started doing research. So the interesting thing is I had to combine three literatures: wine literature and trade literature and tax literature. And if you've ever been to the archives in one of the European countries, you know what the big pain this is. You get a big box, there's a description of the box in like some journal somewhere, and you don't know when you open the box whether it'll be 2 pieces of paper or like a few hundred pages of tax statistics. It'll just say, like, the description will be trade data or trade information, right? And that's what you'll see. And you have to and so you have to spend the whole day, and it takes like an hour for the boxes to arrive, because you have to fill out the form, you submit it, and then you wait in the archives for like an hour for them to bring it to you. And so that's what I had to do for like years. And so me and my fellow French economic historians would like celebrate finding a nice box by having a glass of wine at dinner or something like that. So the story I want to tell you about is Britain actually had a huge trade deficit prior to the Glorious Revolution. Most of that trade deficit was with one country, France. And attempts to raise tariffs even higher were fought by many of the people who had to pay the tariffs and the beneficiaries. But war with the Louis XIV provided the opportunity that protectionists had wanted, because during the 25 years of war, there was no trade at all with France. During the time of this war, new industries developed in England from scratch. Modern beer making, modern gin and whiskey making were developed during this time period. So now new interest groups arose. So when the war ended, now these guys wanted tariffs to protect them. But once the British started putting tariffs to protect them, the British started raising taxes domestically. And now they could collect it. Why? Because they had a threat. If you don't pay your taxes, we're going to lower the tariff on wine. Right? So now they have both a carrot and a stick. Other countries didn't have that very convenient political economy. So that's like the core of my story. Let's look at this. So I'll just give an example. So this is a measure of amount of wine imported from various countries in gallons. These are imperial gallons, so 1 imperial gallon is roughly 4 liters. Okay? This is before the war, these 2 bars. This is from France in blue. The other major export of wine was Spain, that's in green. Notice this thing in pink, Who is it from? Portugal. Notice something interesting. Portugal exports almost no wine before the war. And then they get this massive increase during the war. You know the famous story of Ricardo, of comparative advantage, that England exports cloth, Portugal exports wine? It's crap. It's not comparative advantage. It's colonial trade. Portugal was almost a colony of Britain at that time. And they had a special treaty called the Methuen Treaty of 1704, protecting Portugal, in which Portugal agreed to have no tariffs on British cloth in exchange for a lower tariff on Portuguese wine. Portugal was such a bad winemaker that they could not sell wine to other countries. Okay? It was considered, in fact, part of the reason for the development of Porto, if you know port, is what's called a fortified wine. You know the original reason was called a fortified wine? Because bad wine from Spain and Portugal that wouldn't survive a sea voyage, they would just add cheap brandy to it. So it was fortified, literally, so that it would survive and last longer. All right? And that was the original kind of booze they got. And everybody hated Portuguese wine. It was garbage. Right? The only good wine was mostly from France or Spain. But that was gone during this period. On the other hand, the British had very favorable relations with Portugal. So that's why many parts of Portugal that had not been winemakers started to make wine, just to export to Britain. That's not a good example for your trade class. So if you teach trade and you said Ricardo says comparative advantage, you should say Professor Nye says this is not a good example. It is not a way to defend free trade, because it's one of the least examples of free trade in history. All right? The important thing to remember is the key to the British tax system are tariffs on alcohol. Absent war with France, they would have probably had to tax land and income. And if they tax land and income, there's more resistance to those taxes. For example, in France, they used to tax what's called les quatre grands, which is like, in terms of they tax land, but they also had a door and window tax. That's why most of the homes from old Paris are dark. It's not because it's like some kind of fashion statement. They're dark because each door and window was charged a tax. There was a tax on glass. And in fact, aristocrats were exempt from the tax. So if you go to Versailles and see the famous Hall of Mirrors, that is a way of showing off. I'm so powerful and we got all this glass and I don't have to pay a tax on it. That's part of the deal, right? So it's like aristocrats who showed off big windows and doors are showing off that they can afford it. You understand? A lot of what you see in Europe is driven by tax policy. When I visited Tübingen, there are still a few old houses from the 15th century that look like this. They're like 3 or 4 floors, but each etage is bigger than the one under it. You know why? Because they taxed only the land on the ground. Okay? In the US, you can see some colonial houses where they used to tax closets, because clothes were one of the few things that middle and upper class people had. So, but the rule was to tax only indoor closets. So some US houses had a door with the closet would open outside, so that when the tax collector came, it went up. If you go to antique stores in New England, you will sometimes find these small mirrors that are painted with a lot of flowers. Why is that? Because the definition of a mirror versus a picture depends upon what fraction of the area of the piece of glass is covered by pictures. So the way they would circumvent that is to have a mirror where they would paint a lot of flowers around it so it wasn't taxed as a mirror. So you have to understand, this is a big deal. The tax policy is big. Furthermore, you really need to understand that alcohol was a big deal. Why was alcohol a big deal? Alcohol was the safest drink in most of Europe. This is before tea and coffee were common. Okay? Energy was expensive, so most people didn't have the wherewithal at home to light a fire to just boil some water. Water was often very bad. You got sick from water. Milk, before it was pasteurized, could make you very sick and kill you. Fruit juice was almost non-existent. So the safest item to drink was booze. All right? In fact, beer was often called part of man's daily bread in Britain. One of the reasons I found out how important this was I talked to the Dutch historian Jan de Vries at Berkeley, and he gave me information showing me that in Dutch orphanages, you all know what an orphanage is, right? That's where little kids who are abandoned are taken. The biggest item in the food budget of Dutch orphanages was beer. That's the food budget. The biggest amount of money they spent was on beer. Now you think about why early European orphanages were not nice places. They had a lot of kids who weren't very well treated. And so think about it. Beer had the advantage of providing calories, being easy to dispense, and probably like a kind of drug to keep them quiet. Right? That's a big deal. So you realize this, today you think about alcohol as more of a luxury. But before it was a very big item. Many jobs up to the 19th century would advertise free lunch for the workers, and it would be very important if they said with beer, right? Or with wine, right? So meals in France or Britain provided to workers sometimes included alcohol. And that was like a big part of the budget. If you calculate the amount of food and wine or beer they consumed as a fraction of the total salary, it was quite significant. So, as a result of this deal, British revenues grew by over 400%. Right? Just think about that. It's just gigantic. And this is in a time period in which, British per capita GNP is still not growing very fast. The British become beer drinkers. And the French changed the wine production tariffs, patterns to deal with the tariffs. See, here's what it looks like in public revenue. Look what happens to public revenue. This is the direct crown revenues. These are from king's lands. This is the direct taxes from property and income. This is all the taxes from excise plus customs duties. Notice the pattern. It's just gigantic. This is one of the things I was asking North. How did they get this to increase? Right? If it was just raising taxes, they could have raised the taxes here. But they didn't. They did it here. And if you go back to your basic public finance, indirect taxes you're always told are less efficient than direct taxes. Right? Standard story, right? A tax on income or wealth is efficient because it doesn't change the relative prices. But that assumes you can tax it at zero transaction costs. With high enough transaction costs, an indirect tax becomes more efficient. That's what the British did. How did the tariff function? This is where you also got interesting details. It turns out there is a big problem with taxing alcohol. How do you decide what to tax? If you tax value or do you tax volume? Most products were taxed by value. The only products that were taxed by volume were alcohol related. Now think about, it turns out that this has many interesting properties. Taxing by volume, that is how many gallons or liters you bring in, is easier. You can observe volume easily. You cannot observe value easily. Right? Think about somebody smuggling alcohol back into your home country. There are a lot of countries where if you import items, you have to declare the value, right? So you have a very expensive bottle of Chateau Lafite, and the tax collector asks you, how much did you pay for that? Oh, I don't know, 15 euros, right? Instead of 1,500 euros, right? It's very hard to verify unless they know. But if it's a volume tariff, you can't hide that. That's number one. Number two, a volume tariff makes smuggling very difficult. Why? Because a volume tariff hits the cheap wines hard and not so much the most expensive wines. But the easiest thing to smuggle are expensive wines. But they're already not paying that higher tariff. Nobody's going to sneak into England and say, is carrying 1,000 bottles of wine under his coat. You might sneak one bottle in, but then you wouldn't save very much in the tariff. You see? So it also weakens the smuggling effect. The third thing that's very important is who drinks the expensive wine? The aristocrats. The cheap wine is the one that's competing with beer. And so the volume tariff removes the problem of smuggling, makes it easier to measure, and still keeps the aristocrats happy. One of the ways, and you have to take this into consideration. The other thing that happened is that the government starts to impose high excises on beer. It's interesting, for example, that in the 17th century, before all this, Britain said, we have pure free trade in beer. Just pay your taxes. The more beer brewed, the better. Suddenly, in the 18th century, they switched to regulating beer very heavily. Why did they do that? Because they're collecting a large excise now, and they want compliance. It's easier to get compliance if there's a cartel. And the cartel actually wants regulation because regulation helps limit cheating on the part of the other cartel members. So again, it goes hand in hand. The only person screwed in this scenario is the customer. Right? And because of this pattern, the French start investing heavily in R&D in wine to produce higher quality wine, because the higher quality wine you sell, the less it's bothered by the tariff. It's not an accident that the middle of the 18th century is when most of Bordeaux begins their intensive classification and intensive promotion of high quality techniques. One way I had to figure this out, so it's very hard, there wasn't very good data. This is just a distribution of wine exports by different country, and you'll sort of see how small the volume, this is by volume. One of the problems I don't have is I don't have value. So if I don't have value, how do I show that Britain is mostly importing good wine, not cheap wine? Well, it turns out I did this. This is an example of the data I got. Most of the trade data will tell you how much wine is imported, but it won't tell you the quality. It won't even tell you the brand. But what they will tell you is how much of the wine comes in barrels versus bottles. What kinds of wine are you going to import that come in bottles? The good wine, because bottles have a high risk of breakage. So you only do it for good wines, which is important to preserve the original qualities of the bottling. Most countries have ratios of 10 or 20 to 1 between the volume of barrel wine versus bottle. In Britain, it's 3 to 1. So you know Britain is importing a very high revenue mix of wines. So this is one of the kinds of, doing research like this is partly a detective story. You have like an idea of what you think is happening. And remember, everybody else is looking at just their piece of the story. They're not connecting it. So what happens is I have to keep developing a theory in my head about what's happening. And then as I find stuff in the archives or the history books, I realize, oh, that's why they're doing that. And then I would say, I bet if they're doing that, they would also do this. And then I would check someplace else. I find yes. And then now I start to feel I'm correct. So I do all these things, and that produces a couple papers, and you put it together in the book. Now, the other part of this story is the beer oligopoly. Right? It turns out that first there's a technological change. During exactly the 20 years or more that Britain and France are at war, brewing technology changes. For the first time, you get industrial strength brewers, able to make thousands of bottles of beer. What was the first kind of beer that was brewed industrially in large quantities? Can you guess? Stout, porter. Why is that? Because the biggest problem in making beer is controlling the temperature. It's easy to burn beer. Stout is less sensitive to a precise temperature than lager or ales. So the early beers were almost all stouts. But that led to economies of scale, which led to big factories, which led to big companies. But in addition to natural vertical integration, driven by technology, the government switches to encouraging it. How do they do that? Well, it used to be, In the 17th century, if you wanted to open a brewery, you simply went to the local judge and got permission and paid the fee, and you could open a brewery. In the 18th century, they suddenly said, for the protection of the health and welfare of British, we need to maintain quality control. So they only allowed you to apply to one specific judge 1 day per year. You had 1 day per year to make your application. Now, the other thing you need to understand about British judges at the time were among the most corrupt in Europe, because British judges had no salary. So how did they make their money? Right? So this is like open graft, right? So you either had to be very rich and virtuous, or you took advantage of your judging. Well, you can bet that the big breweries owned that judge. Right? And in fact, if you got denied the right to brewery, you had 1 day a year to petition. So that had the effect of encouraging consolidation. The other thing that happened is something called tied houses. I first learned about this, I was doing my research, by going to Tübingen. And I was very surprised because Germany has a wide selection of excellent beers. But in every pub I went to in Tübingen in the early 90s, there were like 2 beers. I said, what's the deal with this? And beer was cheaper than Coca-Cola. It turns out the pubs were owned by the breweries. Or the land was owned by the brewery, and the deal was, in order to get the low rent, they had to sell a certain amount of that brewery's beer to get the lower rental price. So I said, well, why can't you have competition? They said, oh, no, we can't have a new brewery. I said, what happens? How can you open a new pub? They said, well, in Tübingen at that time I was there, they said, first there's a meeting of the town council, and all the other breweries must agree that there aren't enough pubs. Right? So we know what will happen in that case. So Germany, which has among the widest selection of fine beers, had a very monopolized market in beer. Tied houses were made very common by the British. The British were among the first to pioneer the widespread use of tied houses. So you think about tied houses plus difficult entry plus economies of scale equals monopoly. This is like stout being made today. The other thing you can look at is you can see this is the blue and the purple are strong and weak beer in terms of consumption going back from the early 1700s to the late 1800s. Notice something that's really strange. For all the 18th century, consumption of beer doesn't change. It's flat. This is very strange. Beer is what is called a normal or supernormal good. Normally, when population increases and income increases, you'll have an increase in the consumption of beer. Notice this lack of movement. This is at a time when costs are falling of producing it. This is the net effect of the tariff. Now, what is this funny green line here? That is gin. And this peak is what is called in the history books the gin age. Right? The gin age is the period during which illegal and bootleg production of gin skyrocketed. And gin was produced in large quantities, partly because of the high taxes on all legal alcohol. But the government said, look at all this drunkenness, look at all this terribleness, we need to crack down on gin making. Hence, this. All right? One of the things that developed was something you know, some of you know this drink now. You get a pint of beer, or half pint, and you get like brandy or whiskey or something, and you dunk it in the beer. Right? That's another way of maximizing your alcohol for the minimal money. Right? In fact, I looked at Russian statistics. It turns out all over the world, as groups of people become middle class, the young tend to switch to more wine and beer. It's always older people and poorer rural people who are the biggest consumers of vodka or hard liquor. Right? And part of the reason for that is that when taxes are very high, hard liquor and people are still poor, hard liquor is one of the ways in which you can stretch out your budget and get as much of a hit as you can. Right? And that's why this is a big deal. I still remember going to Iceland when I was doing this research. See, I go everywhere for the sake of... In Iceland, I was very shocked to find in the 80s that alcohol was very heavily taxed. Very heavily. I remember they took me out to dinner after a talk, and I didn't want to buy the expensive French Bordeaux. They said to order wine. I said, no, just order the French. Why? Because the tax was so high, the difference in price between ordinary wine and the elite wine was very small. Right? It's kind of like if you put a $50 a bottle tax, you're going to push people towards a more expensive wine, right? Because most of the difference is being driven by the initial tax. That's the Allen effect. Okay? The other thing that was weird in Iceland was that beer was illegal. Beer was illegal because they said beer corrupts the young. That's like what's accessible to the young. But what was legal was Icelandic vodka. Right? Which is, you know what the Icelandic name for Icelandic vodka is? What it translates to? It translates to Black Death. Okay? And because it's a licorice flavored vodka. It's like vodka with like a licorice flavor. It tastes awful. And you just know Iceland is cold, but they often like have cases of hypothermia. Drunks in the winter in Iceland, you know, they'll leave the bottle sitting outside so it'll like fall far below zero, like minus 30 Celsius or something like that, and then it'll take a slug of the Black Death, right? So they get hypothermia. The temperature drops, they get a heart attack, and they die. Right? How did the beer ban disappear? One pub got the idea of importing Swiss Mousy beer, which is non-alcoholic beer. And the students would buy that with a shot of Black Death and pour the Black Death in the Mousy beer. And eventually the government figured out, okay, we'll just legalize beer too. But you see, alcohol policies are really, there's a lot of interesting stuff from both a historical and an economic perspective. There's a lot of papers you could write on alcohol policy. So the point is that initially, the interesting thing about this is that initially the tariffs, which were purely meant to protect British products, start raising so much revenue because of the excise that it becomes the more important reason for the tariffs. So for example, in the early 1800s, when the free trade movement comes, Britain says we should go to free trade. They actually go to France and they go to Spain, they said, let's have a trade treaty. And the French and Spanish go, great, are you going to lower the tariff on wine? They said, oh no, we can't do that. So not surprisingly, France says we don't want a trade treaty. Right? So it's really funny, right? You have all these guys preaching free trade, but when asked about the tariff on alcohol, they say we can't change that. And in addition, remember, there are substitutes for alcohol. So things like not just rum, but coffee and tea are perceived as substitutes. Anything you drink is going to remove anything you drink, even if it's not alcohol, it's going to take away time from drinking alcohol. So these are all different kinds of substitutes. So anything that was a substitute beverage was also heavily taxed. Moreover, the biggest tax was on sugar. Why is sugar the biggest tax? Exactly, sugar is used to produce alcohol. One of the ways in which you increase alcoholic content is to use sugar. So again, so if you look at it, now you understand, well, if you look at the British budget, tea, coffee, sugar, and then also wines and brandies are highly taxed. They're all related to the same class of objects. Finally, in 1860, a treaty is agreed between Britain and France, which leads the French to remove all prohibitions on British textiles in exchange for lower tariffs. And the British lower tariffs on alcohol. They do it two ways. They both lower the tariff on alcohol, but they switch from ad valorem, from by volume to not exactly ad valorem, it's actually by alcoholic content. Which helps France because Portuguese and Spanish wines have higher alcoholic content and higher costs. So switching to a lower tariff that's also related to alcoholic content helps the French. The other reason they do it is that for the first time they can measure alcoholic content. because the Sykes hygrometers is invented, which is a kind of measuring device where you can take a small sample of the liquor and then immediately ascertain the alcoholic content. So you see how technology and tariffs and policy are moving hand in hand. 1860 is the key event. Contrary to the conventional wisdom, contrary to what all the historians tell you who are wrong, Professor Nye tells you that the real event that led to European free trade was the 1860 Treaty of Commerce. Why? Because the 1860 Treaty of Commerce was a bilateral agreement that's most favored nation. Think about it. The two most powerful countries in the world at the time agreed to basically a trade deal. Everybody doesn't want to be left out of this. So within a decade, every other country in Europe has signed a trade agreement with either Britain or France. And because it's most favored nation, if you sign with one of the two, you get the benefits for both. Everybody gets the lowest set of tariffs you get. And in a short time, Europe is interlocked with bilateral trade agreements. So this is not a world in which everybody suddenly reads Adam Smith and says, we should lower tariffs. It's more like Britain and France make a deal and everybody's scared of being locked out. Just think of what would happen if the US and China signed a free trade agreement that's bilateral and only US and China. How long would it take before the rest of the world signed into it? Right? How long before they would just, people would go nuts. They would say, we're going to be left out of the biggest markets in the world if we don't sign an agreement. Why did historians tell us about free trade France? Well, for one thing, this is a great example of the value of hypocrisy. The French said, we don't believe in free trade. This liberal economic stuff is nonsense. We just believe in rationalizing tariffs. And then they lowered tariffs faster than the British did. The British said, we believe in free trade, and didn't lower their tariffs and why. Right? France also had many small but economically insignificant tariffs. So you can't just add up the kinds of tariffs they had, you have to figure out what the weights are. And always remember, the most controversial regulations are not always the most important. Every day you read about stuff in the papers that seems important. But until you verify economically its significance, you may be missing the forest for the trees. Because the things that get people excited may not be the thing that's making a big difference. It's just like entitlement. Very often people will argue about this tariff or that tariff when the biggest problem is entitlements or Medicare or Social Security or something of that sort, or even environmental regulation, which can dwarf a few tariffs on steel or iron or things of that sort. I say all the time, France does more but says less. Napoleon III promotes free trade by not claiming to be a free trader. Napoleon III is one of the most interesting monarchs in all of Europe. Napoleon III was traditionally hated by historians because he was the small Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was not as successful in reforming the French economy. But Napoleon III is very interesting. He was in exile in England where he got his free trade ideas. He came to France as a liberal, supported the 1848 uprisings, and was elected president of France. He then became the first person to grant all males voting rights, full male suffrage. What was the first election about? What do you think was the first thing they asked to vote after all males were allowed to vote? Huh? No. The first thing this liberal did was to get everybody to vote on whether he should be president for life. And part of the reason he extended universal suffrage is he was very popular with the common man. So this is the guy who was a promoter of democracy and liberalism. He extends the franchise to votes, and they vote on making him president for life. A year or two after making him president for life, he crowns himself Napoleon III, Emperor of France. Right? But then, the weird thing about this is that the same guy who gives himself absolute power in France then starts to remove his power. He starts to put into place genuinely democratic institutions. So, for example, the Council of State, which was purely a rubber stamp at the beginning of his reign, was able to oppose him by the end of his reign. In fact, many of the institutions he put into place while in power were maintained in the French Republic. Napoleon III is also responsible for the French railroad system, for liberalizing the French stock market, for liberalizing French joint stock companies, for promoting banking in France, and for the Anglo-French Treaty of Commerce. Moreover, until the 1850s, working men's wages did not rise. From the late 1850s through 1900 saw the biggest rise in average working men's wage in the entire history of France over a 50-year period. So it's very interesting that this guy who starts out as a liberal and ends up as a royal emperor is also the one who triggers the most liberal period of French growth. He is hated by historians because he lost the war with Prussia that cost him Alsace-Lorraine. And they always talk about he wasn't very educated, which meant he wasn't very good in Latin and Greek. And so they used to refer to him as sometimes Le Petit Napoléon, or L'Idiot Napoléon, or Napoléon le Crétin, which means the idiot Napoleon. That's the term in many of the literature. But in fact, he is arguably the most important French leader of the 19th century. So, as I joke, maybe this is hypocrisy pays. Right? Saying you're one thing and doing another may actually work very well. Just to give you some idea of the change made, here is what French wine imports looked like before the 1860 treaty. This is the 1860 treaty, this line. Kaboom, that's France. Notice what happened to French exports to Britain. It goes up 600%. Right? Spain also gets a boost. Portugal gets a slight decline. Not surprising. If you look at customs as a share of revenue, UK versus France, France customs are actually low. The UK it's initially a big share and it falls. What does this mean? I call this the law. This is a great example of the law of unintended consequences. A tariff meant to be temporary out of a one-time conflict basically reshaped the tastes and the fiscal systems of two countries over the next 150 years. And lesson for scholars is verify even the most basic facts. Always, as I said, if somebody gives you a factual statement that's provable, like something that's observable, historians are to be trusted. But when historians interpret what happens, especially economics, don't trust them. Or in the Russian sense, trust but verify. Yes? You should, and that's the only way, this is how you find good papers. Many of my earliest papers, the papers that got me tenure, were basically papers in which somebody said something, and it was obvious to everybody, and if you look at the literature, so-and-so quoted, so-and-so quoted, so-and-so quoted somebody else who made it up. And then I went back to the literature and actually looked at the data, and I found totally different things. So I could get a totally interesting story. One final thing, people always ask me, does this mean free trade was bad? No. Britain succeeded despite having inefficient tariffs, right? It's a political economy that explains it. It doesn't mean that tariffs are inherently a good thing. But sometimes it may be a necessary evil in terms of the politics of how you improve. So for example, you could say that 18th century rent seeking paid for liberalization in the 19th century. But no one has actually studied this rigorously. So nobody's ever actually done estimates on how much the tariffs cost Britain in a static sense, and then how in a political economic sense, what were the alternatives, and what would the cost of that be in some kind of GE model. Nobody's ever done that. One of the things I'm doing other projects now, but in my really old age, maybe I'll come back to this topic. The other thing to remember is that fiscal is not necessarily equal to economic success. More revenue does not mean you're a better economy. It just means you have more revenue. Right? If your increased revenue comes at the cost of efficiency, it's actually a net loss, not necessarily a net gain. So in other words, somebody who really understands this must show that the growth occurred because and not in spite of the taxes of the 18th century. Policy lessons. Remember that political saliency, that is how important a subject is in the newspapers, in the history books, is not the same thing as its economic reality. Don't trust contemporary opinion. Historians put a very big emphasis on what observers say. But it's like the financial crisis. What people said, what newspaper writers said about the financial crisis is not necessarily a good guide to the financial crisis. You want to know, you want to understand very deeply the macroeconomics and the banking theories underlying, and that's where the action is taking place. But if you're not trained in economics and you don't look at these numbers, you will take for granted the discussions in the literature. Finally, just to end this, how does one balance the gains of professionalization against the rise of parliamentary rent-seeking? Parliament became very powerful and also very corrupt at the beginning of the 18th century. Walpole was the only British prime minister who came in as a non-elite aristocrat. By the time he stepped down as prime minister, he was the richest prime minister ever in England. And you know where that came from. That came from the beer guys in Parliament, right? The other thing that's interesting is why were the British elites willing to permit reform in the 19th century and the 18th century, while other states failed similar reforms? That's a very deep question, too, that explains, or that's part of the question of how modern Europe developed. Let's leave it at that. Thank you very much. So I guess there's time for questions.
Just like there were two, just to get it started, maybe the conversation, there were like two things that came to my mind. First of all, one of my PhD colleagues, she looks at Britain and why Britain actually became mercantilist again in 1932. And so I think maybe like going a little bit further in history, I think she just tries to explain why Britain abandoned free trade and became mercantilist in 1932. The second thing, because you talked about all these alcohol policies, this reminded me as a German about the German or the Bavarian purity law. And I think you can find some economic reasons for the German purity law as well. So the German purity law says that only hops, barley, and water are allowed. Yeast only came later, I think, exactly. So, but I think the original one was only these three things. And I think the idea behind this was to prevent competition, a price competition with bakers, because they used wheat and rye, and they wanted to avoid this. And there was also some protectionist element to it as well. So because I think in northern Germany, they had different additives, and I think the Bavarians wanted to protect themselves from that, and that's why I decided on this German purity law. So not really a question, I just was inspired by your alcohol policy stories.
Well, I'll tell you a story. I was the guest of honor at the first Beeronomics conference held in Belgium. Okay, in Belgium, and it was sponsored by the Belgian beer industry. It's the only conference I've ever been at where every coffee break had 3 beers. There was a stout and 2 different kinds of beers at every coffee break, right? So it was a very exciting but low-key conference. However, a fight almost broke out. I think if we could, I thought at one point we would have war starting in Europe, because the Germans got up and gave a speech about how Reinheitsgeboten, which is this German purity law, produces the best beer. And then the Belgians said, we have this high variety of beers. And the Germans said, most of those beers aren't beer. So then there was this shouting match that erupted in the audience between the Belgians and the Germans. And it started out very polite, but by the end of the talk, everybody was yelling at each other.
Because in the EU case, even a ruling
That's
what's considered what is beer.
Exactly. And I remember at night, we had a wonderful dinner with like 8 courses and 11 different beers. It was a tasting from the lightest beer to a dessert beer. So that was a very interesting conference to go to. If you ever have a chance to go to the Beeronomics conference, I strongly recommend it. Other questions? 10 minutes. Yes. Yeah, get the.
Don't you think that the ability of Britain to collect those tax on tariffs and stuff comes from the single fact that they are an island?
Partially.
Because you don't mention it, but in my opinion, those are like, when you control the ports, and especially back then where they were either military or just city port. They were just able to collect the taxes, like counting the barrels that were coming in and be like, all right, 52 barrels, this is going to be like X pound and something like this.
I'm glad you asked that question. I did look at this problem. Remember, the bulk of the revenue is not coming from the tariff, it's coming from the excise. And the excise was still hard to collect in the provinces. The only reason they could collect the bulk of the excises was because London grew to be the biggest city in Europe. It was arguably the biggest city in the world. They had like 500,000 people in the 1700s. And the concentration of people who had no opportunity to brew on their own made it easier to collect the excise. So if you'll see, even from statistics in those days, collecting the excise away from London was not as efficient. And the concentration of people and money and power in London made London a very big supporter of the excise. So I think if you look in the 17th century, despite the fact it was an island, Britain's ability to collect any tax was very weak. So it was one of the reasons that they had given up on it, was that they had tried raising, for example, the excise, and they found revenue would go up very little or not at all. In contrast, France, because of the way France was created under Louis XIV, was basically a union of regions that either joined voluntarily or were forced. You may find what's interesting is that again, I looked at the original statistics in France, and I went back to the original documents. In some of them, they talk about something called dons gratuits, which is free gifts or free donations, right? These are parts of the revenue that are given by regions in France, presumably in times of emergency, like war. And in one of the reports I read, it was written on the side to the king. It said, "Sir, this year it was harder than usual to collect the voluntary gifts. We had to send extra soldiers to make sure that the voluntary contributions arrived." So that tells you something about the nature of tax collection. Yes, back here.
Thank you for your lecture. And did you check that high tariffs were inefficient for economic growth in England? Because
no, as I said, I didn't do it.
I've heard about the paper that high tariffs were efficient for countries in 18th century for economic growth if there were tariffs for manufacturing goods. So maybe I've heard something of this.
It makes no sense because manufacturing goods were such a tiny portion of the GDP that almost nothing that they did in the 18th century would have a big effect. Moreover, in Britain, if you have to understand, the tariffs on part of the reason Britain grew in the cotton industry, it's a little bit like Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley grew partly because it was ignored. Nobody thought it was important. In the similar way, the most important textile in the 17th century was wool. So almost all the regulation was on wool. Cotton developed under the radar, so to speak. And that's why a lot of the technological innovations came in cotton. In fact, at one point, France had the famous war on cotton calicos. These were these cloths that were very colorful, and they were coming in from India, so they banned them. But then there wasn't enough because the locals were making copies, which was competing with the French-protected woolens. So what happens if you read Heckscher, his famous book, Mercantilism, he has a passage where he talks about a raid in a small town in France. He talks about in this raid of illegal cotton makers, several hundred people were arrested. It said like 150 were, like 100 or so were killed immediately, another 100 or so were broken on the rack, that is in torture, and then the remainder were imprisoned. It said none were pardoned. Right? There was widespread anti-cloth making prohibitions that were very restrictive. And Heckscher has beautiful discussions of the detailed regulations they put to limit substitutes and things of that sort. Any other questions?
So the story is in the end about one country that has a huge trade deficit towards another, and they try to solve it with tariffs. That reminds me of a contemporary problem with the US and China. Can we learn anything from history that tells us anything about what's going on today?
Well, I think one of the things we could learn is that we shouldn't, I really think the GATT system of trying to have global solutions is not working, because many of the things, even what's called free trade, are really involve regulations. For every trade that's agreed, in order to get the GATT signed, they have extra regulations. I really think the lesson we should learn for today is the advantage of very strong bilateral agreements, because they create unilateral incentives for others to join the agreement. And I think bilateral agreements with most favored nation clause may actually work better than insisting on a multilateral. Now, Bhagwati doesn't agree with me on this, but he usually cites England in the 18th, 19th century as evidence of this, and I pointed it out, this is wrong already. And so this is an issue I've had some disagreements with. But there are a lot of strategic reasons why bilateral agreements are easier to deal with. Multilateral means you're going to the lowest common denominator, and often what you're taking away in terms of tariffs is offset by increasing regulation on other margins.
Thanks, John. And if the later ability to produce clear water really affected the consumption of beer and everything?
No one's really quite studied that, but it must have, in the sense that relative to income, I'm sure alcohol consumption is much lower today. I mean, in other words, you can calculate the price elasticity of demand for these things. The problem you have is that, for example, in France at the end of the 19th century, when consumption is really taking off in wine, it's also a period of restraint because of the phylloxera epidemic. It devastates the vineyards. When they come back, wine is starting to take off, but then the French reimposed high regulations in the early 1900s, supposedly to maintain quality, but because a lot of the smaller wineries were complaining about the onrush of cheap mass wine. Today, it's reversing. The French are suffering because Australia and Italy and the US produce varietals. So the French are very big on the appellation, which city or town it comes from. But the appellation are very hard for ordinary people to understand. So for example, if you go to a Russian supermarket, you'll see many French wines which have strange names that sound like a more expensive wine, but they're just made up names for a cheaper market. And they don't sell as well as, say, American wines or Australian wines that just label them Chardonnay or Cabernet. And for mass market, arguably that's a more efficient system than the appellation system, which is very good only if you're buying Chateau Mouton or you're buying, Gironde or something like that, very specific. So you have these ups and downs of regulation that affect these things. And there are all these debates about how the regulation is matched to the different changes in technology and things of that sort. Spain and Italy had to overcome the problem that through the 70s, there was a lot of inconsistency of wine production. So very often, the same wine from the same vintage, from the same vineyard, would often taste very different in very different batches, which also hurt their reputation. The Germans have suffered a lot because they believe in this overly scientific labeling system, so it's so precise down to the barrel, but it also makes it very hard to signal quality. And it also limits the appeal of the German wines, which tend to be sweeter. And then there's the overall change in taste. It used to be the most expensive wine in the world in the time of the Tsar, of Nicholas, was Chateau d'Yquem, because Sauterne was considered better than any red wine. So the Tsars drank Sauterne with the regular meals. But today, except for Chateau d'Yquem, which is still expensive, many of the other great Sauterne are actually a bargain. So Soudbureau, Climont, all these second, third tier Sauterne don't cost very much compared to the second and third tier red Bordeaux. So that you have this mix of policies. A final story I leave people with, since I have to end, is that when I first started going to France in the 80s, it was always interesting to see that the French mostly drank red wine, even in the summer. And the Americans would be the ones likely to drink beer. But then over the period of the late 80s and the 90s, the EU and lower tariffs and lower, common regulation led to lower prices. And so by the 90s, tastes converged. People tended to drink more red wine in the winter or for dinners, and in the summer when it's hot, everybody, French or American or Belgian or German, whoever, would drink cold beers. And you see this pattern all over the world, that the more people, Hong Kong, for example, used to be the third largest absolute consumer of cognac in the world. Right? So even though Hong Kong is tiny, right? Because they would drink cognac with dinner like wine. But then as they become upscale, they switch to beer and wine, like every other middle class place. And the major differences are driven by local tax policies. All right? Thank you very much. I think we're...
Thank you. Yeah, now it's time to have some coffee.